Today I want to talk about some of the work that we've been doing with hemp. And earlier today we talked about niche markets. And back in the early part of 2019, it looked like this was going to be the next big thing. There was a lot of excitement when hemp was legalized in Utah, and a lot of interest and a lot of people that scrambled to get some hemp plants and get them in the ground in 2019. And I think since that time we've learned a lot of lessons. And I want to share a little bit of what we've done and what things look like. So I don't think I need to talk too much about what hemp is. I think most of you have heard about it the last 2 years and probably heard the good and the bad and know at least the basics. It is a plant that's been cultivated for a long time, and it's grown for a variety of reasons. A lot of purposes. It can be used for seed, for fiber, for oil, and obviously medicine. Oil is the biggie. That's what most people in Utah and in most places of the country are growing hemp for is cannabinoids, mainly for CBD, but also other types of cannabinoids. So there's two important things that you have to understand if you're growing hemp, and those are these cannabinoids, the big two, and that's THC, which is the compound that's responsible for the high that will come from cannabis, that's really high in marijuana. And this is the cannabinoid that's regulated. You cannot exceed a certain level of THC in your hemp production, or the state of Utah will have to destroy that crop. So really, really critical. The second is your CBD, and that's one of the major cannabinoids that most people are interested in, and the thing that they're really trying to produce the most per acre of is CBD. So just want to give you a quick snapshot if you haven't seen this before, but this just kind of shows what it looked like in 2019. We saw hemp growers and processors pop up all over the state, and lots of interest, lots of new growers, some from out of state, but some native Utah growers that threw in small, sometimes large fields of hemp. And then, as happens with most specialty or alternative crops, is everybody gets really excited, everybody jumps in, and the market tends to tank. The supply outdoes the demand, and prices crash. So this is just a quick snapshot from Texas in the early part of 2019 to the early part of 2020, and you can see that everything dropped significantly. So in the early part of 2019, we started to receive a lot of questions from producers around the state about hemp, and we had not been growing hemp prior to that time, so we had very little experience with the crop, and so we felt like we needed to at least start some research so that we had experience with it. We could say how it grows in Utah, what yields we might expect, how we might irrigate it, how we might plant it, other things like that. So we started doing some basic research at the beginning of 2019, just to have some experience with it and help guide growers. So what we did is last year in 2020, we produced an acre of hemp on one of the Utah State farms near Logan. It's actually in the south part of the valley near Wellsville. And we put this hemp in a water optimization trial that we were doing. And we sandwiched it just right in between a big section of alfalfa and corn. And we did irrigation trials, but we also did variety trials. And so today I'm just going to talk about the variety trials for sake of time. But these variety trials, we conducted them underneath a linear irrigation system. And we wanted that to kind of represent pivot conditions to see if it does well under a pivot. And so in this case, we used, for what I'll talk about today, we used a pivot or a lateral and used some low elevation sprinklers to water the hemp. In the late part of May is when we planted, and we planted transplants in all of our studies and planted them at about a 5 by 5 foot spacing based on the best recommendations we could find. The transplants were about 6 inches tall when we transplanted, and we knew that we needed to get water on them as soon as possible. And so within an hour or so after we got all these transplants in, or I guess immediately after we put these transplants in, we ran the lateral across to try to irrigate them and keep them alive right after transplanting. So when we were putting our last transplants in, water was on its way over the transplants. So we looked at 11 different varieties. And I didn't have good pictures of all 11. Some of them were videos. So I'm just showing 3 varieties that were sourced from a nursery here in Utah. And those were Tokyo, Abacus, and Trump. So we looked at those 3 Utah varieties plus another 8 varieties from Colorado. And you can see the names of those there. Some variations of Abacus and then some other varieties. And I just quickly wanted to show you how we did this. So we took one span. So this is 160 feet, one span of that lateral. And we grew the 11 different varieties in 3 replications and in blocks of 9 plants. We wanted to really, really do a good test of how well these plants, how well they did. Okay, so just want to talk a little bit about how we collected the data. If you're getting ready to harvest hemp, the first thing that you should do is go talk to your father-in-law and borrow some of his clothes, because hemp is tremendously smelly, and when you get done working around hemp, your clothes are going to have a permanent stench that you cannot get rid of. So you'll notice here, these 2 pictures, you'll notice that I'm wearing the same clothes. And the day, hours after we finished all of our hemp harvest, those clothes went to the garbage. You just can't get the smell out. So what we did is in September and again in October, we harvested different varieties, ones that were mature and ready to harvest. So we came in with a machete or with a weed whacker with the blade on it and cut the plants down. And then they take quite a bit to dry. And so we had the lateral there, so we fastened them up to the lateral and just tried to dry them hanging out in the field. Probably not the ideal method. Most people will do that inside of a building just to protect them from wind and weather damage. We didn't have a space to dry all these, so we just hung them in the field, stayed there for several weeks until they were dry enough that we could run them through a bucker. This is a machine that a local farmer in Logan had built and let us use. It just has big brushes, and then you stick the hemp plants in and strip off all of the leaves and the buds. So that's how we harvested our plants. And now I want to show you some of the things that we found. First, I just want to show you how many plants we lost. So these transplants are expensive. Usually they're about $4 to $5 a piece. And you can imagine if you're putting those at 5 by 5 foot spacing, the costs add up really fast per acre. And so every plant you lose is bad. And so we, under a lateral, probably really similar under a pivot, we saw anywhere from no loss up to about 40% loss of the transplants. And on average, it was about anywhere from 10 to 15% of the plants they died. Probably because we couldn't get enough water on them fast enough and frequent enough at the early stages after transplanting. So you've got to factor that in. If you're thinking about growing hemp, you'll probably lose a good portion of your plants. Next is the yield. So I just want to show you so for these 11 varieties, these are the dry biomass yields. So this is the leaf, all of the leaf and the flower material. And this is what you care about when you're growing it for CBD. Most of the CBD is in the flower, but there's also some in the leaves. So generally you just harvest both of them. So we saw statistically, we didn't see a lot of difference in these, but you can look at that and you can see that, yeah, in some of those varieties, there was a difference. We had some that weren't yielding very much. We saw half a ton to a little over a ton. And our highest yielding varieties were over 2 to 2.5 tons. So that's important, but what's most important is your CBD yield. And I'll show you that here in a second. We also looked at stem yields just because some people have interest in growing this for fiber. Not much here in Utah, but some other places are really interested in fiber. So we took a quick look at the stems and the stalks, and this is what we saw. Again, there's just a big difference. A lot of them had pretty similar stem yields, but there were a few varieties that really just were massive and had a lot of stem. Okay, next I want to show you the CBD concentrations over time. So this is the really tricky part about growing hemp, is that you're trying to maximize CBD and keep your THC levels below 0.03%. And THC and CBD typically go together. When you have more of one, you have more of the other. And so you have to kind of optimize the timing to get the most CBD and still reach still stay under your limits. So this is from September to October. Right here, you'll see that some of these lines stop, and that's because we harvested these varieties here. And then the rest of them we left because they hadn't flowered yet. And then we harvested them just a week after, the second week of October. So what you'll notice is that CBD concentrations are quite high. So one might say, well, let's harvest early, but I'll show you that THC is also high, so you can't do that. So concentrations are quite high and then they drop. As you get closer to harvest, we start to see kind of in all varieties, very similar trends. That CBD concentrations kind of level out, but then right before harvest, it looked like we saw a small increase in CBD. I think we stopped irrigation about right here towards the middle to the end of September. And I think that might have been why we saw some slight increases there. Here's THC. So again, early on in early September, these concentrations are high, way higher than 0.03, but they do all come down. And almost all of them came below that 0.03 threshold as we got near the point of harvest, except for a few varieties over here that we harvested earlier. So this is the most important thing. So this is your CBD yield at harvest. So we took the concentration and we multiplied it by the yield of the hemp. And so you'll see here that there was a few varieties that just shone. They shined. Here's a cherry Abacus. It had the highest CBD yield, about 25 pounds of CBD per acre. So these ones in yellow here were harvested early. These Abacus plants flowered really early. And so we harvested them earlier, about a month earlier than the rest. And then the rest of these varieties were all harvested in mid-October, and their CBD yields were all really, really similar. And then finally, the THC concentrations at harvest. So I just showed you here that there was a few of these that really yielded a lot of CBD. This Abacus 2 and this cherry Abacus. But you look at the THC concentrations and they are high. So it wouldn't really matter if you got great CBD yields if you exceeded the limit and you had to destroy your crop. And that's a big challenge with hemp production. So so you got to really watch that. We probably should have harvested that Abacus much sooner than mid-September, just so we harvested when we had reached, or when we were below that threshold. But that would have meant that our CBD levels would have been much lower. The rest of the varieties that we harvested in mid-October were all, on average, they were all below that 0.03 threshold. So they would have been, they would have met the criteria, and we would have not had to destroy that crop. So in summary here, if you're interested in growing hemp, and at this point we're not advocating that people do that on a large scale. I think some are going to be able to make it work on a small scale in a really specialized situation. But if you are doing it or considering it, keep in mind that you're going to lose plants, and you may lose anywhere from 5 to 25% of your transplants, unless you're just a superb grower and can do much better than we can, which might be true. Also, that Abacus and different variations of Abacus variety has to be harvested earlier. It gets hot really fast, and it matures a lot faster than other varieties. And so it's prone to high THC concentrations. But it may also yield some of the greatest CBD yields if you can figure out the right timing to harvest. Two of the varieties that did the best in terms of CBD yield in this trial were Tokyo and Dutch Cherry, and both of them were below the limits for THC. And then last point here, expect high amounts of spatial variability in your plant sizes and your vigor. We saw that across the 1 acre that we had last year. Just a huge variety in the size of the plants, and so and in their concentrations in CBD and THC. So a lot of variability that you've got to deal with if you're interested in growing hemp. With that, I'll say thanks, and let me take a few questions if we've got time.
It does look like well, putting you at the end, we always have time. see how late people want to stay on, right? But there is a really good question here. Does UDAF have the ability to test for THC anytime or just at harvest? And if someone is growing and their THC levels are really high early, can their operation get seized or burned by UDF, or is there time given to fix the problem?
Great question. I'm not sure I know all the details and regulations. I do know that UDAF typically does their testing 30 days before harvest, and so you would, if you go on their website, they have a great website that has lots of question and answers about all of their policies and their permits that are required. And so before, anytime you go to harvest hemp, you have to let UDAF know, and they would come out and do testing. I didn't get really familiar with those because UDAF allowed us to kind of do our own testing. So we just sampled every week and watched CBD and THC concentrations. But it's a challenge. So I think in general, so best thing I can recommend, check with UDAF and really ask them that question so you're sure. But as far as I know, if your THC levels do get a little bit high but start to come down, I think UDAF is flexible, and they will, as long as you're not harvesting a product that's above 0.03, I think there is some flexibility there because like I showed with that data, THC concentrations can go high and then they start to drop as you get closer to harvest. But great question, but yeah, just be sure to check with UDAF before you